The Bullet That Esther Stopped. By Delbert Griffith. I shot Papa square in the heart, but he didn't die. That damn Bible he carried with him saved his life. I was considerable lucky that Papa had his axe at hand, and that he kept it sharp. I picked it up. It was a heavy thing, so I swung with all my might and put it right through his head. Seeing his brains made me throw up. I moved away so it wouldn't get on Papa. That would be disrespectful. Papa was a big man. I couldn't bury him like that, so I started chopping off his arms and legs with the axe. I was down to the right leg when Sheriff Culverson showed up. Wouldn't you know it, he came to arrest Papa for stealing a couple of old lady Renner's chickens. Papa didn't have to worry about that now. Hell, he didn't have to worry about the drought or where his next bottle'd come from either. I reckon I did him a favor, saving him from all that worry. Sheriff Culverson looked at me and looked at Papa. I done threw up again, so the smell was something terrible in the vicinity. I looked at the sheriff. He was shaking his head and had a sad look on his face. I reckon he didn't want to take a 19-year-old girl to jail. Especially me, seeing as how I was his daughter's best friend. Maybe he'll let Cassie visit me in jail. The jailhouse only had the one cell. That door a clankin behind me sounded like what Mama would call ominous. I kinda know what that means by the words around it. Corntex, I think they call it. I would know a lot more if Papa would have let me go to school. He said girls don't need school. They need to learn how to cook and to clean and to please their man. I'm damn good at cooking and cleaning, but I don't think I know how to please a man. Papa was a man and he was never pleased. Oh Lord! Here comes the sheriff and another man. I seen him around. Mr. King. He's always all duded up and talkin' fancy and smilin' and swingin' his walkin' stick around. I sure would like to catch me a man like that. I bet he don't beat his women. Not much, anyway. He ain't smilin' now. I reckon I'm in a heap of trouble. Well, Papa won't be slappin' the tar out of me for my sins this time. Both men sat across the table from Esther. The sheriff had placed the gun that Esther had shot her dad with, next to the Bible that had thwarted Esther's original plan. The metal gleamed in the harsh light of the room, sitting as silently as the three occupants. The ceiling fan squeaked quietly, not doing a very good job of cooling off the room. The open window allowed the sunlight to stream through, and a soft breeze brought a little relief from the heat, along with the scent of jasmine and dust. The harsh, unforgiving angles that the sun cast in the room matched Esther's mood. Esther reached for the wounded Bible. She wanted to feel the torn cover and open it up to inspect the damage. The sheriff pulled it towards him and opened it up before sliding it to Esther. The soft sigh of the Bible moving across the table sounded like the whisper of broken dreams. Notice anything? The sheriff leaned back and watched Esther closely. Esther inspected the Bible. The bullet had torn through a significant portion of the Old Testament. It had stopped at the book of Esther. Yes, sir. Esther stopped the bullet, I reckon. Mr. King smiled, though he didn't want to. The sheriff nodded his head and leaned forward. Don't you find that a little odd? Esther shook her head. That's your name, young lady. Mr. King spoke. His rich, resonant voice filled the room. Dust motes danced and the breeze quickened. Yes, sir. The men looked at each other impassively, but both were thinking the same thing. The girl was thick-head. Mr. King pointed to Esther's face. Your dad do that? Her black eye and a swollen nose did all the testifying for her. Yes, sir. Told me I shoulda caught a man by now, and he warn't gonna feed no old maid much longer. He been drinkin'? Sheriff Culverson leaned back, crossing his arms. He already knew the answer. Yes, sir. Mama always says that Papa only drinks on days endin' with a Y. I reckon that's true. Esther played with her hair, twirling it between two fingers. She looked away from the men and gazed outside, lost in her own thoughts. So you decided to shoot him? Yes, sir. But the Bible stopped the bullet. Yes, sir. Mr. Kind leaned forward and stared at Esther, causing her to blush. That was when you decided to take the axe to his head? Esther stopped playing with her hair and sat still for a moment before answering. I suppose so. Papa would have killed me if I didn't kill him. You feared for your life? Mr. King continued to stare intently at Esther. Yes, sir. Mr. King abruptly stood up and shook the sheriff's hand. I have all I need. He left quickly, so quickly that it startled Esther. She looked at the retreating back and worried that she had offended such a gentleman. Am I gonna get the chair? The sheriff stood slowly, as if it hurt him to do so. He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than Esther had ever heard it. No. You'll get 25 years in the women's prison in San Antone. Minimum. Esther started counting on her fingers. You'll be about 44, Esther. Damn. I reckon I'll be too old to catch a man by that time. The sheriff felt his chest tighten just a little at those words. And Mama? How old'll she be? How old is she now? Esther paused, deep in thought. Says she was born in 1901. Then she'll be about 60. Esther nodded, standing and smoothing out her skirt. Reckon she'll take me back when I get out? The sheriff scratched his forehead and looked at the floor. I don't know, honey. I just don't know. They're calling us heroes. The newspapers, that is. I suppose we are, but I don't know that I feel heroic. I do, however, feel a difference in me now that Papa's dead. Liberation would be the word. Papa would have hit me if I had ever used that word in front of him. Papa had been drinking, of course, and smacking Mama around. Cassie and I were hiding out in my room, wondering when it would all stop. At one point I heard Mama scream. That's when I went out to investigate. Papa was pointing a gun at Mama. I didn't even think about what to do. I just did it. I stepped in front of Mama just as Papa shot. The bullet hit my Bible. Yes, I carried a Bible with me, right over my heart, but only when I was wearing overalls. It was fortunate that I was wearing them at this point. I staggered backward and fell. The impact of the bullet stunned me. Mama fell as well, trying to hold me up. That's when Cassie came charging out of the room and started to wrestle with Papa, trying to get the gun out of his hand. We heard another shot. Papa took a bullet to the gut. He died 2 hours later, in a lot of pain. Cassie stood and fairly sprinted out of the house. She came back a few minutes later with her dad, the sheriff. The look on his face was one that will not soon leave me. Pinched and drawn, with worry written clearly in the eyes. Mama should have never been home. She was supposed to go to San Antonio to see her sister, but Papa beat her so bad the night before that she refused to go. I believe that Papa beat her so severely so she wouldn't go. He was like that. Cassie shouldn't have been there either. Her father told her never to go to my house when my Papa was around, but Cassie often defied her father. Her father was so relieved that Cassie wasn't injured or killed that he never punished her. On the contrary, he hugged her tightly and kissed her on the cheek. I had never seen him do that before. I'm supposed to write a story for the newspapers. The one in San Antonio wants to give me, and Cassie, $50 each for our story. An astounding sum. Some rich people in San Antonio also want to give us full scholarships for college. Imagine going to college. It's in Denton, but that's even better. Cassie and I can get away from the blight of the hill country and experience a different kind of life. A different kind of life. I'm filled with a substantial happiness, and I wonder when it will leave. Never, I hope. The real hero is Mama, and I'll make sure the newspapers know that. All those years of insisting that I go to school, even when Papa beat her for her sass. He called it that anyway. It was grit and toughness and love. I'll call it the stuff that heroism is made of. That has a nice ring to it. And it's the truth. All 3 steps to the elevated porch squeaked under Mr. King's tread, though the man was not heavy. Like the rest of the porch area, they needed paint, rusted nail heads poked out of the wood, loosened by years of neglect and hill country weather. The evening was soon to turn into dusk. Just spoke to the judge. Cassie ain't to be charged. He said she did us all a favor by shooting that man. Sheriff Culverson didn't show it, but a wave of relief flooded his body. He relaxed a little and felt his breath coming easier. Mr. King sat down and lit a cigar, offering one to the sheriff. Both men took some time to light their cigars, ensuring that they had a proper draw. This was not a task but a ritual, and it was not to be taken lightly. The sheriff went inside his house and returned in a few moments, bearing a bottle of whiskey and 2 small tumblers. Each man filled their glass to the amount desired and sipped. Mr. King grimaced at the first sip, then took a second, larger sip. I reckon she did us all a favor, sure, but it was an accident. I'm damn happy the judge was of the same mind, the sheriff said. He took another sip of whiskey and sat his glass down, concentrating on puffing his cigar and enjoying the news. You know, I'm surprised one of those women hadn't killed the man before. He sure liked to beat his women, Mr. King said. The mama, the sheriff said. Mr. King turned his head slightly. Pardon? The mama. She made that girl, Esther, get an education. I hear she took a beating or 2 for her daughter. Damn fine woman, in my opinion. Mr. King nodded and smiled. He had already heard the news. You went to visit the widow, I hear. The sheriff glanced at Mr. King and then quickly glanced away. Offer my condolences, in an official capacity. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, bestowing faint light and beautiful colors to the sky. Fireflies came out of hiding, their pinpricks of light giving the large front lawn a magical appearance. As if fairies were in attendance. As if a miracle had been bestowed. You were there for 2 hours, Sheriff. That's a lot of, condoling. The sheriff turned and stared at Mr. King, his steely blue eyes narrowing a little. Mr. King laughed and hastened to explain. The old biddies in town. You know what they're like. Most of them had you and the widow making a baby during your visit. Vicious old cats. The sheriff spat out the words. Makes sense, though. You and the widow. Esther and Cassie are best friends. They'd be tickled pink to become sisters, so to speak. And the widow's a fine, strong woman. You done have us at the altar. Mr. King tamped the ashes from his cigar onto the porch and scuffed them with his boots. He poured himself more whiskey and watched the fireflies perform their chaotic, beautiful dance. Your wife's been gone for 12 years. I reckon you grieved enough, Sheriff. I figure the widow's grievin' was non-existent. Can't really miss a man that beats you, can you? The sheriff poured himself another 3 fingers of whiskey and stood at the railing beside Mr. King. He sighed and turned to Mr. King, handing him a $1 bill. I'm hiring you for a 2-minute consultation, Mr. King. Mr. King looked at the bill and put it in his breast pocket. What's on your mind, Sheriff? The sheriff paused for a moment, trying to get the words out of his mouth. I heard Esther and Cassie talking one day last year, just before Christmas. Esther was telling her that she wanted to shoot her daddy dead so he'd stop beating her mama. Well, that froze me. Mr. King looked at the sheriff, a thoughtful expression creasing his face and pursing his lips. I figure she would have done it one day, Sheriff. I guess Cassie took care of that, though. The sheriff sighed. I reckon. So, why the $1? We got attorney-client confidentiality now, right? Mr. King laughed, nodding his head. Yes. Very clever, Sheriff. But I wasn't gonna divulge that little piece of information anyway. I expect a receipt when you get to the office tomorrow. Yes. Of course. Come by after work, Sheriff, and I'll buy us a couple of beers. I seem to have an extra $1 in my pocket. The night darkened and the breeze stilled. Even the fireflies slowed down. Soon they were gone, letting the darkness of the night have its way. Both men remained silent. Cigar smoke curled and drifted upwards past the porch lights, disappearing into the blackness. Mr. King left after finishing his whiskey. See you tomorrow, Sheriff. And I'll expect a wedding invitation. I want that receipt, young man. The rest of the night passed as it should have. Frogs croaked lazily, crickets chirped, and lights winked out one by one across the countryside. 2 young ladies were dreaming of adventures at college. 1 sheriff was thinking of matrimony, and 1 widow was contemplating the mysteries of fate and providence. The Bible with a bullet hole in it was, in due time, returned to its rightful owner. The whereabouts of the mangled Word of God is currently unknown. Not Mary, by Nicole C. The unnerving chorus of cutlery scraping porcelain echoed throughout the room. Tension hung thick in the air, palpable enough to reach up and slice into it with my steak knife. Beside me, my sister sniffed. From my periphery, I could see her red-rimmed eyes staring blankly at her untouched plate. I cut into the slab before me, crimson juices forming a greasy puddle. I took a bite, relished the tenderness. The peas encroached into the sea of mashed potatoes like invading soldiers. "Would you please pass the potatoes, Mary?" Mother asked from the other end of the table. I nodded, heaving the dish over to my sister to pass on. Her gaze remained fixed on her plate as she sat on both hands, legs trembling. A small, choked sob escaped from her lips. "That's quite enough, Leah," Father growled, stabbing into his own steak. Leah shakily grasped the bowl, ushering it to Mother. Between them sat Jonah, barely peeking over the edge of the table and pushing his food about. At the tender age of 5, he was blissfully ignorant. I chewed a bit of gristle in the next bite, watching Father's brow furrow as he took a sip of wine, a rogue tendril staining his snowy beard burgundy. He cleared his throat, an action which rendered the table still, waiting with bated breath. "Children, the ultimate test is almost upon us." I hated the way he spoke, like that of an old novel. Mother rested a bony hand over his and listened intently. With her other hand, she fingered the gold cross hanging from her neck. "We will not let the enemy destroy our union. We will not succumb to their devilish tendencies, for they are blind to the ways in which we serve him. They will never know such unwavering love and loyalty. And for that I pity them." Mother nodded in understanding, her silvery bun bobbing. Father tossed his napkin over his plate and stood, chair screeching dully on concrete. We watched as he climbed the nearby staircase. Stray spots of maroon that had earlier leached into the wood marked his steps, evidence of what he'd done to protect the sanctity of his family. There was once a time when I would have chased after him, lunging for the open door, yearning for sunlight. But the scar on the back of my head itched like an ugly deterrent. I made it a point to constantly remind myself of who I was, where I came from. Fragments of memories. The way my mother used to rub my back in the morning when she woke me for school, the sound of my father's work shoes on the hardwood floors every evening, the hum of the fish tank in my childhood bedroom, remained filed away in the depths of my mind, growing fuzzier with each passing day. But I dared not speak of these memories. They were mine and only mine. Leah, now gangly and naive in the throes of adolescence, was more pliable. I imagined she couldn't even recall things like the details of her mother's face or the way it felt to ride a school bus. When Mother and Father told her something, she accepted it at face value. And Jonah, in all his cherubic innocence, had never known another life. The harsh fluorescents were his sun and moon, every day the same. Sometimes it made me want to weep, but then I reminded myself he knew no different. Perhaps it was better that way. Father's thunderous descent broke my thoughts. Mother stood at his approach, collecting some of the equipment he came bearing. As he laid a piece before each of us, the breath caught in my throat. My eyes followed the transition from dark metal into laminated wood that led down to an unmistakable component, a trigger. Out of the children, only I knew how to operate a gun. When I was 8 years old, my father took me hunting for the first time. I recalled the way the cold seeped into my fingers and toes as we waited for hours. We flinched at any flicker of movement, which often turned out to be a rummaging squirrel. But then, he arrived. Statuesque and bristled, his sinewy figure strutted into the open field, unaware of his armed audience. His antlers were a thorny crown that dipped with him as he scoured the earth. "Take the shot," my father egged, helping me hold the heavy rifle. We'd gone over the process an umpteen amount of times, but now the steely grip felt wrong. I dropped my shoulder, fingers slipping from the trigger as the barrel slung towards the ceiling of the tree stand, and my father cursed. That was the first time my father swore in front of me. In one swift motion he grabbed the gun, took aim, and fired. I covered my ears and watched in silent horror as the creature's body quivered with the impact. His legs buckled and he scrambled for a brief moment before taking off, blood spilling from his flank. My father took my shoulders in his hands and kneeled square before me. "You don't ever let the gun drop like that, especially with the safety off," he scolded. Hot tears coursed down my cheeks, stinging the wind-chapped skin. My father profusely apologized for swearing and raising his voice, wrapping me in a hug. But I wasn't crying because he yelled. I kept replaying the look of sheer panic as the bullet ripped through the deer's flesh, the terror and confusion he must have felt. We trailed our victim for a short while, following the blood-stained leaves of early winter. He didn't make it far, having collapsed in a small clearing. Panting laboriously, his onyx eyes stared up in blank defeat, and I saw myself in their reflection. Before I could process the scene, another shot rang out, and the deer stilled. "A kill shot," my father explained, to end his suffering. "When you see the enemy, you take the shot," father said then, breaking my trance. I was back in my chair staring down at the weapon before me. Leah ran a trembling finger over the safety, ensuring it was on her father's crash course. Jonah, too small to wield such a device, was given a knife instead. Never before had we been permitted to use any kind of weaponry. Anything more than a butter knife was forbidden. Father and mother claimed it was for our own safety, but I knew better. And that didn't stop me from fantasizing. A ballpoint pen embedded in a windpipe, a broken bedpost as a club to the head. I'd had my fair share of time to ponder the possibilities. Leah and Jonah may have been taken at malleable ages, but I refused to fully yield. The slight quiver in father's hands and the way mother's complexion paled meant it was all hands on deck. Though I didn't know whose blood painted the staircase, sticky on the soles of father's shoes, it had led us to such a cataclysm that I dared to dream about life beyond the concrete. I yearned to return to a world where my name was my own, not the one I'd been forced to adopt. I longed to hug my mother and father, to bask in the sunlight on a summer day, to see my friends, to witness the light at the end of a nearly decade-long tunnel. Could this be the end? The gunmetal was cool in my clammy palms. I contemplated aiming it at father or at mother. It would be so easy. But what if it wasn't loaded? What if it was just for show? And could I really do it? "Let us go," father commanded, leading our ragtag troop up the stairs. At the top, father unlatched the door, leading us into an empty hall with another door at its opposing end. Bringing up the rear, I glanced back into the abyss where time passed indefinitely. And as the next door opened into a moonlit room, I realized I would never allow myself to return. Gilded crosses glinted from every wall as we wound through the house. And, like something from a movie, a muffled voice seeped in through the cracks in the windows and doors. "Come out with your hands up." "Father?" Leah croaked. "Who is that?" Father ignored her, the click of his safety flipping off. He slung the gun around his back, nodding at mother as he approached the door. The rush of blood thrummed in my ears. Leah mimicked father and switched her safety off, and mother did the same. Greasy coils of nausea knotted my gut as I followed their lead. I swallowed the bow rising in my throat. Nothing about the unfolding situation felt good, or right or godly. Father gripped the doorknob with a fierceness and turned. Golden porchlight flooded the entryway. For a moment, Father's face looked younger in the warm glow, and I wondered what led him to this path in life. Slowly, he raised his hands above his head and stepped outside. "Drop your weapon!" an extraneous voice shouted. "It's over, Arthur," another called. "Do the right thing and drop your weapon." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Father replied simply, as if he were declining an invitation to a party. "Your godlessness is a stain on this earth, and I have to protect my family from such evil. I can't let you destroy the Lord's work. You think you can interfere with his plan?" Disconcerted grumbles echoed as a reply. "Dear?" Father called. Mother, gun cradled in her arms, crept to his side. Her skin was sallow, brow damp with prickles of sweat. The woman, always so composed, seemed to be cracking. "Mrs. Goodfellow, drop your weapon now," the second voice commanded. Tensions heightened with each passing second. "Put down your weapon, and put your hands up." Negotiations persisted, but I knew Mother was as stubborn as a mule and loyal as a dog. She would follow Father to the ends of the earth. The crunch of boots on gravel drew near. Father stiffened. "Not another step," he threatened, raising his gun. "Don't turn this into a standoff, Arthur," the voice urged. "That's not going to do either of us any good." A treacherous moment of silence ticked by. Every part of me trembled. "I will not let you tear this family apart," Father declared coldly. "Maud," he said, nodding at Mother, who lifted her gun. Her finger made contact with the trigger, and she pulled. A deafening blast ripped through the cool night air and all hell broke loose. Shouts of anger and bewilderment erupted, and I watched as Mother's body lurched back in a swarm of bullets. In collapsing, her gun fired. I fell to the floor, covering the important parts of myself. Father crawled lamely over the threshold, dragging Mother's body with him. With a weak kick, he shut and locked the door. Blood from their matching wounds seeped into the floor, a crimson trail smeared behind them. Amidst the chaos, Father tenderly brushed stray hairs from Mother's face. He caressed her cheek in his calloused hand as she gasped for air, her blouse soaked through and the cross dangling from her neck now stained. Faint whispers of prayer spilled from his lips as he continued to comfort Mother. Barked orders swirled beyond the window panes, the thud of boots heavy on the porch. From the floor, I glanced around. Jonah was nowhere to be found. "Jonah?" I called quietly. "Leah, Jonah's not." I turned. Leah lay face down nearby, arms splayed by her sides and gun resting under the nearby sofa. "Leah?" On shaking limbs, I clawed my way over to her. Terror gripped my throat so viciously I struggled to breathe. Thick locks of brunette cascaded into the floor, shielding her face from view. I carefully grabbed her shoulder, rolling her over. A strangled cry escaped me as I recoiled at the sight. Blood trickled from her forehead down the bridge of her nose between lifeless eyes. The bile that earlier threatened to purge itself did so then. I wiped my mouth, one last dry heave racking my body, before curling up beside Leah. Garbled whispers across the room caught my attention, and I looked to see Father lying beside Mother, gazing up at the ceiling of the foyer. Though worse for wear, he still managed to recite the Lord's Prayer unfalteringly. Mother remained limp, devoid of life. "Mary?" Father called blindly, like a sick game of Marco Polo. "Mary, child, are you still there?" I rose, stepping gingerly until I stood over top of him. His snowy beard, once stained with wine, was now marred with fatal streaks of maroon. "She's dead," I said solemnly. "Leah's dead." I didn't want to reveal that Mother's gun misfiring was the cause. I wanted him to think it was his fault, which, truthfully, it was. Everything was his fault. Sometimes we as servants of the Lord must make the ultimate sacrifice. "Shut up," I hissed, jabbing the barrel of my gun into his forehead. Father grew silent for a moment. "Mary, you are a daughter of the one true king," he rasped. "You are our last hope at ending the war of evil that has been waged against us. When you see the enemy, take the shot." I sniffed. "You're right, Father." His breathing was ragged, blood curdling in his lungs as we spoke. A twinge of sorrow pinched my heart as I gazed down at the dying man before me. But then I remembered all the hurt he'd inflicted, all the years he'd stolen, and anger sizzled in my veins. Realization flashed across his face. "Mary!" A single blast rang out, a kill shot to end his suffering. The footsteps and chatter outside ceased. For a moment, the world was silent. "My name's not Mary," I spat, dropping the gun. With a quick yank, I tore the gold cross from my neck, dropping it onto Father's still chest. A muffled cry emanated from somewhere close by. My heart clenched. "Jonah?" I called, wheeling around in search of the noise. I padded across the living room to the pantry where the cries seemed to stem from. Carefully, I turned the knob and opened the door. Head buried between his knees, Jonah sat curled in a ball. "Jonah!" I rubbed his back, and he glanced up. His eyes shone with tears. "Jonah, it's okay, I'm here." Just as the front door splintered open under the crack of a boot, I wrapped him in a hug. Early Bird by P.J. Town. If a killer awakes before dawn and puts his boots on, to paraphrase a famous song, you know it means trouble. If the killer happens to be the slew slasher, then it's trouble with a capital T. No one knows who the slew slasher is, naturally. If they did, then they'd call him by name. But the newspapers like to give serial killers a dramatic moniker. I don't know which paper coined this one, most probably The Sun or some other tabloid, but it soon caught on and now it's on everyone's lips. Especially those belonging to the poor residents of Slough itself, twice hapless. Because so many of their number have fallen victim to the slasher. 2. Because they live in Slough. And if you think I'm being unkind to a town of over 150,000 people, I would refer you to the British poet laureate in the 1970s and 80s, Sir John Betjeman, who invited friendly bombs to fall on the place. I think even those from Slough, the Sloughs, would agree that there's not a lot going for it, apart from its proximity to Windsor, with its castle, great park, pretty streets, river, tourists. The only tourists that would ever visit Slough would do so by mistake, perhaps taking a nap on the train out of London towards somewhere more interesting, and even reading, for example, is more interesting than Slough, waking, being confused, panicking, and jumping off too soon. It really is such an awful place that I wouldn't be surprised if some sloughs might, deep down, welcome a visit from the slasher, just to put them out of their misery. But I jest, of course. Before we go any further though, and there we have it, for those who are not from the UK, Slough isn't pronounced like though, it isn't pronounced like through, it isn't pronounced like thought, it isn't pronounced like cough, and it isn't pronounced like rough, although sloughs are, and rough is, of course, a perfect adjective to describe it. No, Slough is pronounced like the British English plough, or plough, as the Americans would have it. In fact, Betjeman might have written instead, "Come friendly plough and dig up Slough." The sentiment would have been the same, and it would have rhymed. More about Slough. It's around 22 miles, 35 kilometers, due west of London. It's in the county of Royal Berkshire. The original version of the television comedy The Office was set in the town. It's where the Mars chocolate bar was invented, and 63% of its people are white, 26% Asian. On that last point, and going back to the slasher, one important thing to note is that he isn't particular about race, ethnicity, gender, age, size, sexuality. All are fair game. Nor can a pattern be deduced from the scene of the murders. And for these reasons, the police are scratching their heads. The slasher's attacks appear to be completely random. All the police have figured out is that other aspects of his modus operandi are constant. He always strikes very early in the morning. He never strikes where there might be CCTV cameras. In fact, all the 13 murders attributed to him so far, there have been more, but it's been found that they were committed by so-called copycat murderers, have happened in secluded parts of the town, a quiet side street, behind a factory on the industrial estate, on a football pitch in a windswept park, in a wood, in an abandoned multi-story car park, in a field. His tool of preference is a Stanley knife, what the Americans would call a box cutter. The fatal cut is to the jugular, from behind. What theories do the police favor regarding the profile of this animal, as the media would describe him? Well, they've decided it's a man and not a woman, because the fairer sex are statistically far less likely to be serial killers in the first place, and also because the method of killing, holding the victim from behind with one hand while slashing their throat with the other, suggests a masculine strength. Which is not to say that a woman couldn't be strong enough, just that, once again, statistics point to a man. The police love statistics. They've worked out there's an 80% chance the man is from Slough itself. The 20% allows for the possibility that it's someone who lives within killing distance and commutes in to do the deeds. What is probable is that he knows Slough like the back of his hand. Those secluded locations couldn't be selected unless he were very familiar with the town, otherwise he'd be running all sorts of risks. As for age, the consensus is that he's in his 30s or 40s. Any younger and he wouldn't have the astuteness or the maturity to meticulously plan his forays. Any older and he might not have the strength to hold people while he killed them. There's been a media campaign, encouraged by the police, to try to discover anyone who might know the slasher, and a reward's been offered for information leading to his arrest. They think that he might be a family man with a terrible secret, but that his wife or partner, or relatives, or children, might suspect something, or that his workmates might have noticed his absence from work on the days or at the times of the murders. Of course, this has inevitably led to a wave of collective paranoia, with people pointing fingers, marriages being tested, friends falling out. The police have received countless phone calls from people convinced their neighbor is the slasher. If they, the police, could transfer all the man-hours used in chasing up the deranged accusations to actually working on the case, they might get closer to catching their man. And then we come to the question of why. Why would anyone commit such gruesome crimes against innocent people? Once again, the tabloids have gone over the top with their theories, insanity being the most suggested. The police have kept their cards close to their chest in this regard. If they start calling the man insane, he's likely to feel insulted and simply up his tally to get his own back. So let me posit a theory of my own. Say the man is far from insane. Rather, he's an exceptionally intelligent and rational human being. Say he planned a small number of murders initially, one of them targeted, the rest intentionally random. Say the targeted murder was to rid himself of a love that wronged him, the others to obfuscate. Perhaps the problem is that he got a taste for it, a taste for the jeopardy, a taste for the planning, and the killings do need that, however haphazard they appear, a taste for seeing the life ebb from his victims, a taste for a job well done. And when I say problem, I mean for the people of Slough. This man has no problem with continuing his spree. In fact, the police will have noted that the frequency of the murders is increasing, a sure sign that the man is becoming addicted to killing, just as one might fall under the spell of heroin, for example. And he can't stop. He won't stop. The people of Slough, the erstwhile hometown of his love, the venue for his revenge, now the ground for his glorious rampage, will not rest easy, not until the slasher makes a terrible mistake and is caught. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But there's the first birdsong of the morning. Dawn's on its way. Must get my boots on. After all, and as we know, it's the early bird that catches the worm. Cell 3.47 by Kate Hughes. Cell 3.47 was situated on the third floor of Bewing and Stocken Gate Prison, slap bang in the heart of London's East End. Known as the Gate, the prison had a reputation for being a tough place to do time. The inmates behind the doors at the gate endured long cold winters in the Victorian slammer that had been condemned many times, but had always escaped closure. It was harsh, it was hard, and it was overrun by rats. Paula Pritchard was the sole resident of Cell 3.47, but due to the rodent crisis she was rarely alone. All her schemes to see to them perish had failed miserably, and she had to accept that while they might have won the ultimate war, her hatred of the vermin would ensure that her battle against them raged in perpetuity. After all, she had time. Paula was serving life for murdering her husband after he cut their TV wires in 1986, causing Paula to miss the EastEnders Christmas special. She was still bitter. There was no catch-up TV back then. In fact, she had more remorse for that than she did for the murder, which wasn't convenient when it came to trying to persuade the parole board to release her, so she had stopped bothering to try. Instead, Paula put all her efforts into ensuring that she was in sole control of the contraband that was bootlegged into the gate on a daily basis. Somewhat against all the odds, she had turned out to be an exceptional entrepreneur with incredible business acumen but would never win a Women in Business award. As she got into bed now, she plotted her next scheme for fulfilling the cocaine orders that always started to pile up at this time of year. The girls in the gate knew how to celebrate Christmas all right. Rita watched and waited from her vantage point on the top of the bookshelf. Paula's eyes were getting heavy. She would be out for the count soon. Rita could be patient, no problem. You learn that as a prison rat. Sometimes tactics were everything. She swung her back paws and applied a little face cream to her tail. One of the best things about living in Cell 3.47 was that Paula's customers often paid in canteen. This meant a reliable stock of snacks, beauty products, paper, and easy access to all manner of things that were dispensed from the canteen hatch. Rat heaven. Prison life for a rat could be easy, but you had to have your wits about you. There was a constant supply of water in the steel lidless cell toilet. Pritchard had tried many times to deny Rita and her crew access to that but had never succeeded. In any event, there was a small sink on the wall, and the tap constantly dripped. This sink was big enough for a family of 4 rats to take a bath, and Rita had even seen a water birth be facilitated in it by the alternative lifestyle rats who lived behind the skirting boards in the staff room in the segregation unit, also known as the block. As soon as Pritchard fell into her doubtless drug-induced sleep, Rita tucked into a packet of Cheetos. Delicious. Pudding was a packet of Cadbury's hot chocolate which she'd had her eye on since it had arrived this morning. But during the daytime the rats didn't come out so much. It was at night when they got their business done. After dinner, Rita was helping to coordinate the digging of a new tunnel after the maintenance team accidentally poured concrete into the main thoroughfare between B and C wing. She watched as Rolly gnawed his way into a pot of noodles. He glanced up and nodded to her with his mouth full, powder from the noodles coating his whiskers. She winked at him fondly. They had been together for 5 litters, and still they flirted like newlyweds. Rolly was a big old unit, a rat who'd eat all night if he could. He wasn't quite as exacting as Rita when it came to menu choices, and last week had eaten a whole box of tampons which had sent Pritchard into a rage when she discovered the mess in the morning. Rolly didn't care, but it had almost killed him. He hadn't been careful enough and a piece of plastic applicator had got lodged in his gullet. Rowena, unable to get her paws around him to perform a Heimlich maneuver, had jumped on his furry white chest to clear his airway. Rita had been beside herself, and if it hadn't been for her daughter's quick thinking, Rolly would have been toast. But within 2 hours Rolly was reaching for an Oreo and telling the tale as if he was the hero to most of the rats on the 3rd floor. They'd all laughed and patted him on the back. The next day Pritchard was crashing around the cell, cursing about not being able to find any coffee sachets. Rita had swapped them for a packet of cotton wool with Ricardo from healthcare, and generally being her bad-tempered, vile self. Rita knew that at times like this it was better to give Pritchard a wide berth than risk her wrath, which knew no bounds, especially when it came to rats. Plastic cups and cutlery fell to the floor. Books were cast aside and makeup thrown all over the place as the fruitless search went on. Rita, Rolly, and Rowena went for a nap in their nest behind the wall, tummies full and whiskers cleaned. It wasn't until much later that they peered out and saw Pritchard behaving most strangely. She was dressed in nothing but an Avengers t-shirt and a pair of woolly socks and appeared to be batting imaginary insects away with this week's edition of Prison News. She uttered something incomprehensible about jungle fever and then proceeded to attempt some kind of Scottish jig. The rats knew that Pritchard was hallucinating. They had seen it with so many inmates countless times. They smoked too much spice and simply went doolally. Sometimes it went further than that, and a heart attack wasn't that uncommon. But Pritchard didn't seem to be that far gone despite the pantomime that was being played out before them now. Rat word got out, and several others came to watch the show. Ruby from the canteen had even brought popcorn, but it was salty, so Rita didn't bother with it. Just before Pritchard was about to climb up to the bookshelf to launch herself into what she believed to be a luxury swimming pool but was in fact her prison-issue laundry basket, something caught her eye. The rats froze. Pritchard picked up her radio and launched it full force into the spectating crowd of vermin. Rita watched in horror as the plastic transistor hurtled in slow motion towards them. There was no time to react, and with an almighty smash it landed on Rolly. Within an instant two things happened. Pritchard vomited all over the floor, and blood began to seep from Rolly's head. His pink ears drooped, his breathing slowed. The rats rallied round, hitching Rolly's sizable frame onto their shoulders and scuttling into the B-wing tunnel with him. By now Rita was sobbing, her tail in her paws. Rowena squeaked instructions as fast as she could, but it seemed that Rolly could not be saved. His wide black eyes still gleamed as he gazed into Rita's tear-filled ones. "I love you, Rita Rat," he said, and then he was gone. Rita felt like her world had fallen apart. Riley and Rose from education ushered her to their nest. She let them feed her syrup on a Q-tip, and then she slept a fitful sleep with Rowena at her side. The next day Rita felt numb, but she went back to cell 3.47, where Pritchard's vomit still pooled on the concrete floor, ice forming on it in the mid-December chill. Even the family of rats from security hadn't fancied that. Pritchard herself was akimbo on the bed, oblivious to it all. Rita stopped crying and looked at Pritchard, that mean-tempered woman who had ruined Rita's life. There was only one thing Rita wanted now: revenge. And everyone knew that revenge was a dish best served cold. That night a meeting was called, chaired by Ricky from recycling. He even had a clipboard. Hundreds of rats were there to hear what he had to say, while Rita sat quietly beside him with a tissue balled tightly into her fist. A plan was afoot. Pritchard was to get her comeuppance. But were the rats in? Hell yes, they shouted, hats and snacks thrown into the like confetti. The excitement grew, and after the meeting, they divided into groups according to their wings and floors. Bigger departments like the laundry would help with logistics and coordination. If the drugs dog from rehab was to be believed and trusted, they had exactly 2 weeks to go before the cells spin. Meanwhile, prison life went on. Paula spent hours in cell 3.47 taking orders and singing along to Last Christmas, which played on repeat on the radio, which she had recently acquired as a replacement by breaking Kelly Gorman's little finger during a game of pool. She could see her breath when she sang. That's how cold it was in here. The kettle was on the boil constantly, and for once her hot chocolate and coffee supplies were not being pilfered every night. Odd but good. If the Christmas trade was as good as anticipated, she reckoned she'd have enough cash to bribe Officer Willis into putting her in for a transfer to a modern prison where she could learn to play tennis and grow old gracefully. Every night the tunnels were full of rat traffic. Never before had such an effort been orchestrated to help one of their own. Rita was beyond grateful but didn't know if they could pull it off. But for Rolly, she was prepared to try. The day of the cell spin finally arrived. The day when every cell at the gate was searched, with absolutely no prior warning given to the prisoners who were made to stand on the landing while specialist teams went through their cells with a fine-tooth comb. The one thing the rats didn't know was the time of the spin. But Reese from the block said not to worry. Everything was in place and Ricky was all over it like a rat rash. Rita spent the whole day watching Pritchard. It didn't take her long to realize that Pritchard must have been tipped off about the cell spin, because over the course of the morning all manner of drugs, mobile phones and weapons were dispatched out of her cell by officers who were on Pritchard's payroll. No matter. The rats had a plan. At 2 p.m. precisely, the alarm was sounded and an announcement over the tannoys boomed out, telling all inmates to exit their cells immediately. Rita's whiskers twitched in anticipation as the rats behind her began to file into cell 3.47, SIM cards under their arms. They dumped the SIM cards and left, and a steady stream of rats continued to do the same. Rita had no idea how many SIM cards were now piled up under Pritchard's bed. Hundreds maybe? Collected from every mattress, nook and hiding place imaginable that the inmates at the gate could dream up. Over 2 weeks the rat teams had found them, stored them in the tunnels and brought them here today. Pritchard's face when the officer swept the SIM cards out from under the bed was an absolute picture. She went from aghast to betrayed, shocked to furious in less than half a second. But ultimately, she was confused. And angry. Very angry. 2 officers took her by the arms and hauled her down to the block while she screamed her innocence, and how she was being stitched up. Rita couldn't have hoped for more. How the kingpin had fallen. That night cell 3.47 was theirs alone, and everyone wanted to come to the party. There were rats in the bed, rats on the TV tuning into channels, rats in the drawers of Pritchard's clothes, and rats hanging from the shelves and bars on the window. Rachel from Kitchens had even managed to get 4 whole boxes of cornflakes up from the basement. They ate and partied until the early hours. Rita had cried as she made a thank you speech, and her heart felt like it might burst. In the morning it was Christmas Day, and this time there was no need to hide at daybreak. Pritchard would be cellular confinement with no windows 3 floors down, and would not be returning any time soon. Someone turned the volume back up on the TV. "Look," cried Rowena. "It's a rerun of the 1986 EastEnders Christmas special." The rats were quiet. None of them had been alive on the day that over 30 million viewers had tuned in to watch Den handing Angie her divorce papers. But they had heard Pritchard ranting about it their whole lives. What a shame, thought Rita, that Pritchard was going to miss this episode yet again. That temper of hers really had cost her dearly. Prison news. Keeping you behind bars, but not in the dark. HMP Stock and Gate is to undergo a full security review after an inmate, who will remain nameless for legal reasons, was found with 347 SIM cards in her cell. The CPS say that the occupier of cell 3.47 was taunting the authorities by collecting this precise number of SIM cards and making no attempt to conceal them. She is accused of running the biggest bootlegging operation ever seen in British prison history and faces a 61-count indictment. She has been transferred to the maximum security facility in Market Deeping, where she will remain in solitary confinement until her trial. Bigger Fish. Posted by Won't Think Straight. Well, boys, let's talk. Malcolm grinned through a beard that looked like a mangy kitten had stuck to his face. Do you have those ciggies for me? This was the last of our 3 meetings with Malcolm. A model inmate, he was exceedingly polite and friendly, a stark contrast to the violent murders he was imprisoned for. I had agreed to help Steve with his postgraduate psychology thesis. This involved some field work interviewing dozens of patients. Most were fairly mundane, a couple were truly horrifying. And Malcolm's was by far the most memorable. The interview had been set up by Steve's mentor, a jovial Dr. Mackenzie. He thought it would be both a valuable experience and a character-building exercise to meet someone with a deeply disturbed past. As an added bonus, he would be amused to have Steve squirm a little. So here I was locked in with a psychopath. Because friends don't let friends accidentally get murdered doing homework. Our first meeting with Malcolm was unproductive, our thoughts mostly focused on trying not to get killed. As the interviewer, Steve was too self-conscious, too careful in avoiding saying the wrong thing, or making sudden movements that might be misinterpreted as a provocation. In reality, we had nothing to fear. Though he confessed to the murder of 6 people 4 years ago, Malcolm had not shown the slightest violent tendency since. His good behavior had earned him the privilege of participating in this program. As Malcolm never had visitors, he was very pleased to finally have some. The second meeting a week later was more relaxed. Malcolm opened up about his childhood. He was an only child in a middle-class family in the middle of suburbia. A rebellious youth, he had run away from home at 17 to elope with a girl his parents disapproved of. For 2 years, they roamed the country taking up odd jobs: short-order cook, bussing tables, minor theft, until she got bored and left him for a richer fling. Heartbroken, he endured a few more years of drifting until his stubborn pride relented, and he made his way back home to ask his parents for forgiveness. He came back to find a foreclosed sign on a derelict house. His parents had spent their fortune searching for him, until they were tragically killed in a car accident a year earlier. He spent the next few years drowning his guilt with whiskey, using up what little remained of his inheritance. On the night of his 34th birthday, he had stumbled to a wharf to drown himself more permanently. Sitting on that dock, swigging the last of his Jack Daniels, he also drank in the serenity of his surroundings. The boats bobbing up and down gently on the water, the twinkling lights reflecting playfully off the surface, the gentle lapping sound of waves against the pier. He gazed at the horizon that beckoned with the promise of things yet to see and experience. He decided wasn't ready to go yet, or perhaps he was too cowardly to go. He wanted to live. He didn't find God, but he did find hope, a reason to live. So he sobered up, worked steadily, and saved up until he could afford a small fishing boat that doubled up as his home. He loved to travel over that horizon when he could, and drop his fishing lines, and just enjoy life on the water. There were many other things he wanted to see and do, but they would have to wait until he saved more money. But now at our third and final meeting, we wanted to know just one thing. What drove Malcolm to brutally kill Todd Weber, his wife Tracy, their sons Jack and Ryan, their uncle Bill, and another victim that could not be identified from the remains? We had to know what made Malcolm snap. Steve handed Malcolm the open box of cigarettes. Malcolm grabbed them giddily and took a good whiff. "Thanks, boys. These'll do nicely," he grinned, putting the box away in his pocket. Malcolm didn't smoke, but many of the inmates did. No doubt that box will buy him a few favors. "So you'll be wanting to know what happened that night then, eh?" "Yeah, why did you do those things in the police report?" Steve pushed his body forward in his chair, and pressed his arched fingers against his lips. "Ah, you've read the report then. You already know what happened." The official court filings duly noted that Malcolm had confessed to the murders and pleaded insanity. A straightforward case, given the crime scene they found. "We've done our research, yes. We've gone through the court transcripts, but you never gave a motive. You never explained why you did it." Malcolm slumped back in his chair, and his body language noticeably shifted to one of apprehension as he crossed his arms and started chewing on his nails. He stared intently at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling for several moments, furiously debating with himself in his mind. Finally he whispered, "Okay. I'll tell ya. I've wanted to tell someone, but couldn't. If you tell anyone else though, I'll deny it and tell 'em you're crazy, okay?" Steve exchanged glances with me, then nodded calmly. I leaned forward with a pen in my sweaty hands, ready to start furiously scribbling notes, as Malcolm closed his eyes and retold his story. It was a chilly Saturday night. I was in happy mood. I'd just filled Smoother Sailing, his boat, with fuel. I was gonna take her out to my favorite fishing spot. I upped anchor at 8 p.m. and pushed off the wharf, hitting full throttle when I got to open waters. My spot was 3 hours away, but I don't mind. I love the sailing, that feeling of cold air and sea spray rushing over you. You know what that feeling is? It's being alive. I hadn't felt that in a very long time. Visibility that night was great, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Being winter and all, there weren't any other boats about. Was just me, the sea and the stars. Just the way I liked it. Around 9:30 my radar picked up another boat about 5 miles ahead. I never saw anyone out there in deep waters that time of night before, so I went to check it out. It was on the way anyway. Closing in, I saw the glow of a sweet-looking yacht, one of them millionaires' boats. All fancy and slick and big and lit up like a Christmas tree. It must have been an 80-footer. She was a real looker. I throttled back to get a good peek along her starboard side. She was the Mary C. I could see her name tattooed all fancy like on that classy ass of hers. A couple of guys were on the deck and a family inside the cabin setting up dinner. I waved a neighborly hello as I sailed by, but only the guys on deck saw me. They just stared and wrinkled their nose like I was some bad smell. So I changed my hand wave to an extended middle finger and sped off laughing. No way I was letting them spoil my mood. I finally made it to my spot and baited my lines and dropped them in the water. I sat back and enjoyed my fishing in peace for a few hours. I was hoping to stay there the whole weekend, but a storm warning flashed up. Not wanting to be caught in a storm so far from the harbor, I pulled up me lines up, made me way back. I did catch a good pink snapper, so it wasn't a wasted trip. I was a bit surprised to see the Mary C pop up on the radar again on my return route. It was around 4:30 a.m. now, and she hadn't moved at all. Getting closer, I could see she was still lit up, but something was wrong. There was a big dent along the starboard waterline, and she was leased in slightly port side. I thought she may be too keen on water. I got in close and yelled out for the crew. Didn't hear anything back but the waves slapping against boat. I circled round slowly and checked the radio for distress signals. There was nothing on any of the frequencies. A lifeboat was still rigged up port side, untouched. The crew would still be on board. I maydaid the Coast Guard and moored me boat to the back of the yacht. There was a board and ladder I climbed to get to the deck. The lights were all on, so I yelled out again. No answer. Nothing. The deck seemed normal. Some half-drunk glasses of wine on the table and some untouched food. Nothing unusual. I went into the cabin and noticed that the doors were busted. Like something big crashed into them from the inside trying to get out. The wooden frame was all splintered. I yelled out again to see if everyone was all right. Still no sound. Inside her was another table set up with dinner. Everything was still laid out neat, no sign of struggle or trouble. Like the crew just vanished as they were tucking in. There was a galley next to the dining cabin. It was messy, but no different to what you'd expect after cooking. I could smell faint onions and meat in the air. Ahead was the forward cabin with the ship's navigation and a large lounge area. I was trying to check out the ship's log when I heard a sudden crashing sound behind me, back where the dining table was. I rushed back there, but it was only some glasses slipping off the table. The boat was now at a pretty bad angle. I saw some stairs leading down to the crew quarters and thought I'd quickly check him out. You know, before the ship sunk, just in case there were people trapped and needing help. Heading down, the carpet was already wet with sea water on one side. I went down the corridor knocking on rooms and opening doors and yelling out for anyone who could hear. At the end was the master bedroom. I should have left the boat then and there. I wish I never opened it. There are some things that are just better left unknown. But it had seemed empty like all the others at first. But I noticed some small shoes under some drapes, like some kid was hiding behind them. I walked up slowly, whispering, "Hey kid. It's all right, there's nothing to be scared of, but we need to leave now." I got no response, not so much as a twitch. So I got in real close, then ripped the drapes away. There was no kid there. Just his shoes. And his severed feet still in them. Like something had ripped him from his body. I fell back and gagged. I ran into the ensuite to throw up, then saw the mirror was covered in blood. I stepped back and slipped on the wet floor. But it was blood, not seawater. I had the blood all over me. I saw 4 more shoes lined up in the bath, with severed feet still in them like the first. I screamed and ran as fast as I could back up the stairs. Near the top I heard someone yell out to me. I was screaming and babbling, but they eventually calmed me down and cuffed me. The Coast Guard had arrived. They did a quick inspection and found more severed feet. They were in the closet of 2 of the other rooms I had checked out. They transferred me to their boat and detained me while they searched smoother sailing. Near my bunk they found 1 more set of shoes and feet, another kid's. I couldn't explain how it got there. 12 shoes and feet in all, 6 different people. They charged me with murder and maritime piracy. When it got to my court hearing, I still couldn't explain what happened. I was the last person to see them alive. I was a thief in my youth, and was found uninvited on a rich guy's yacht. I had their blood all over me. Their remains were found on me boat. The Mary Sea had sunk by that mid-morning, taking any other evidence with it. What choice did I have but plead insanity? Malcolm seemed to have aged 20 years as he finished telling his story. But then he looked at us, smiled, and the age washed away, along with the weight on his shoulders. When our time was drawing to a close, the guard arrived and was cuffing him back to his cell. Steve still felt he needed some closure. "Hey Malcolm, so you didn't do it then? You don't have to be here. We can, we want to help you out. Clear your name." Malcolm only chuckled. "What makes you think I want to get out of air? I confessed, didn't I?" "But why? Why confess to something you didn't do? That's crazy. Think about this. I know I've had a long time to think it over. In here, it's not so bad. I'm watched 24 hours a day. Someone's always checking on me, watching carefully who comes in and out, making sure I'm safe. One thing fishing has taught me is no matter how good you think you are, there's a bigger fish out there ready and waiting to eat your lunch. Or eat you for lunch. And outside, well, that thing is still out there. And still hungry. Out there, you have no one watching over you all the time, making sure you're safe. So who do you think is really crazy, eh?" That was the last we saw of Malcolm. Betsy the Doll. Posted by the Dalek Emperor. Like most people these days, I had a fucked up childhood. Who doesn't, right? My father took off before I was born and my mother was left to care for me on her own, a skill she was sorely lacking. My mother slipped right back into the drug-addled, party lifestyle she'd enjoyed before I was born and had soon turned our 2-bedroom apartment into an opium den. For the first 5 years of my life, I walked around in a confused, terrifying mist. The smoky air would flood down the hallway from our living room and slip under my bedroom door. It always seemed to linger for days. I know now that my mother wasn't a bad person, just a victim of her addictions. When she did have spare money, she would put food in the house or buy me clothes from Goodwill. The only pieces of furniture I had in my bedroom was a mattress set and a little blue and white toy chest. Not that I had a lot of toys to put in it, of course, Just the 3 I had gotten for birthdays. One was an art kit, one was a red wagon, and the last, my pride and joy, was a doll named Betsy. Betsy was my best friend. We would have imaginary tea parties together, sleep together, and even take baths together. Sometimes, I even remember her voice. When I thought back on my conversations with the doll in adulthood, I realized that I was likely suffering from delusions, thanks to the always present butts of smoke that laid claim to the dingy hallways and drafty bedrooms of our small apartment. Still, I remember the sound of her voice, a pleasant, tingling lilt that was almost always coupled with a raucous giggle. I also remember the things that she said to me and the things she wanted me to do. She asked me to steal usual food or pens and pencils. She wanted me to bring her forks and knives and hit the bad man who slept on our couch. It was always something and I would always get in trouble. But she wouldn't. When I told my mother who had put me up to these games, she would scoff and shake her head. She never believed me. Adults never do. Around my 6th birthday, I asked my mother for a birthday party. I wanted to invite the mean girls from school and serve them cake and ice cream to make them like me. I remember standing in the kitchen that day with such hopes, having just asked the most important question of my entire life. The glass bottle of Coca-Cola I held was shaking in my nervous hands. I waited with bated breath as my mother continued putting groceries away, almost as if she hadn't heard me. But I knew she had. Finally, just as I had failed a second time to muster the courage to repeat my question, she turned around and gave me a flippant shake of her head. "A birthday party? Laura, that's ridiculous. I can't afford to feed 15 children that aren't even mine. Hell, I can barely afford to feed you. You eat like an elephant, especially for a girl your size. Or, I'm sorry, Betsy does. There's barely anything left for me to eat around here, much less a classroom of other people's brats." My face fell as she shook her head, mumbled something else under her breath, and stumbled off into the living room. I heard the music go up then as more people walked in the door. Some left, some stayed. I never knew them either way. It simply wasn't fair. My mother threw parties all the time. What about me? I was a kid. All my friends had birthday parties, and now the mean girls at school would know I was too poor to have one, and they would tease me even more. I felt tears start to well in the corners of my eyes, and I choked back a sob while I ran to my room and slammed the door behind me. Betsy was lying on the bed and smiling. She was always smiling. Usually it made me feel better, but today it just made me angry. She just kept staring at me, smiling. She was going to tell me to do something bad again. This was why Mother wouldn't throw me a birthday party. It was because of all the trouble I got into because of her. This was her fault. Betsy didn't have to go to school, and Betsy never got in trouble like I did. And in my young mind, I truly believed it was the doll, not my mother, who was to blame for everything. I snapped then. I screamed in indignant rage, and I threw the bottle as hard as I could at the bed. It hit Betsy on her forehead, and she fell on the floor. Good. I picked up the bottle and I hit her again and again. I thought I heard her laugh, and I hit her harder. Then I laughed. When my rage was spent, I dragged Betsy to my toy chest and threw her in. I slammed it shut and kicked the chest against the wall. I never wanted to see Betsy again ever. I never owned another doll after Betsy. About a week later the police came, and 2 nice ladies took me to live in a new home in a new state, with food and toys and no drugs. The trunk went into storage and the wagon disappeared. I never saw my mother again. As I got older, my foster parents admitted she was in jail, doing 25 years. That was fine with me. I felt nothing for her anyway. I still had nightmares because of my life with that woman. But then slowly, I began to heal. I focused on doing well in school, and I ignored my mother's letters from prison. She reached out to me several times in my 20s, as well, but I always declined her calls. That is, until this morning. I'm 30 now, with my own children and a loving, honest husband. I have a beautiful house, 2 dogs and a career as a social worker trying to make a difference for kids who had it bad like me. I'm happy, I'm steady, and I'm content. So when I got a voicemail from my mother informing me she had been paroled and that she wished to speak, decided to let her say her piece. Since the kids were home from school, I went out into our shed in the backyard to return my mother's call. The shed was the children's domain, and they used it to play in the summer. I sat on my old toy chest, which was currently being used as tea party table, and dialed the number she had left me. 3 rings. Hello? Laura? Hello, Mother. How are you? Oh, Laura, thank you for speaking to me. I know you have your own life now and a family. I would love to meet them someday. I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. Mother, you are not meeting my kids ever. And since you called me, I am going to what I have needed to say for years. The opium, the heroin, they destroyed you. And the worst of it is that you almost took me down with you. I was 5. That was no home for a child. Honestly, I'm surprised it took you so long to get caught. Laura, I know how it seems, but I honestly know nothing. Look, it hardly matters, and I do understand why you would feel that way. Why you would hate me and not want me to meet your little ones. I learned a lot about forgiveness while I was away, and oh Laura, I am so sorry about Betsy. Betsy? I paused, confused. Why would you care about her? I know, Laura, believe me, I do. It was all my fault, the drugs, the partying. And Betsy, oh God, if I had only paid attention, if I had only known. She's gone, and it's because of me. As my mother began to cry, I tapped my fingers on the toy box, impatiently. The drugs had clearly fried her brain. Mother, I sighed. Why are you talking about Betsy? And why do you even care? I know where Betsy is. Right underneath me. What are you talking about, Laura? Oh God, where is she? I shifted uncomfortably. Well, Betsy's in the trunk, where she's always been. There was a beat of stunning silence. What do you mean your sister's in the trunk? Sister? What the hell are you talking about? Back on drugs so soon? That's a record even for you. Betsy is a goddamn doll. I locked her in my toy box a few days before you got arrested for possession. Laura. Oh God, no. No. Laura, what have you done? I wasn't arrested because of the drugs, Laura. I was arrested because of Betsy's disappearance. You always called her your little doll, but we thought you knew. Oh God. We thought you knew. Laura, no, what have you done to my baby? My mind had gone blank, and with no emotion I set the phone down next to me and stood up. I could hear the muffled sound of my mother's anguished cries and feel the dark clutch of possibility in my own chest. Memories were stirring in the back of my mind, threatening to flood forward into my consciousness. They pushed against a door in my mind that had been locked so tightly for so long that I had forgotten it was even there. Was it even possible? Could the trauma and the opium have really led me to believe that a small child was actually dull, begging for food and utensils to eat with, asking me to protect her from the bad man? No. I slowly turned around and brought my eyes down the makeshift tea party table. Surely it was too small. You couldn't fit a person in there. You couldn't. But then, what about a very small, starving, emaciated child? What about her? Would she fit? Would an investigator even bother looking for a person in this chest? I knew I wouldn't. It was just too small. And I was sure we had opened the toy box at some point over the years, hadn't we? Or had something swimming in the dark recesses of my memories always stopped me? I couldn't remember ever seeing it open. I knelt down to the ground and opened the clasps. It would be better to not look. After all that I had overcome, this new life that I had earned for myself. It could all be undone by opening this toy box. I shouldn't open it. I should throw it in a landfill and forget it ever existed. I should not look inside. I opened the chest. I never had a doll. My mother never could afford to buy me one. I never had a wagon either, for that matter. But I did have a toy box, a pretty, blue and white toy box. And when I was 5, I beat my little sister to death and put her in it. Balloons. Posted by 1000 Vultures. When I was 5 years old, I went to an elementary school that, from what I've come to understand, was really adamant about the importance of learning through activity. It was part of a new program designed to allow children to rise at their own pace, and to facilitate this, the school encouraged teachers to come up with really inventive lesson plans. Each teacher was given the latitude to create his or her own themes, which would run for the duration of the grade, and all the lessons in math, reading, etc., would be designed in the spirit of the theme. These themes were called groups. There was a space group, a sea group, an earth group, and the group I was in, community. In kindergarten in this country, you don't learn much except how to tie your shoes and how to share, so most of it isn't very memorable. I only remember 2 things very clearly. I was the best at writing my name the right way, and the balloon project, which was really the hallmark of the community group, since it was a pretty clever way to show how a community functioned at a really basic level. You've probably heard of this activity. On one Friday, I remember it being Friday because I was excited about the project, and it being the end of the week, toward the beginning of the year, we walked into the classroom in the morning and saw that there was a fully inflated balloon tied off with string taped to each of our desks. Sitting on each of our desks was a marker, a pen, a piece of paper, and an envelope. The project was to write a note on the paper, put it in the envelope, and attach it to the balloon, which we could draw a picture on if we wanted. Most of the kids started fighting over the balloons because they wanted different colors, but I started on my note, which I had thought a lot about. All the notes had to follow a loose structure, but we were allowed to be creative within those boundaries. My note was something like this. Hi! You found my balloon! My name is Name, and I attend elementary school. You can keep the balloon, but I hope you write me back. I like Mighty Max, exploring, building forts, swimming, and friends. What do you like? Write me back soon. Here's $1 for the mail. On the dollar I wrote, for stamps, right across the front, which my mom said was unnecessary, but I thought it was genius, so I did it. The teacher took a Polaroid of each of us with our balloons and had us put them in the envelope along with our letter. They also included another letter that I assume explained the nature of the project and sincere appreciation for anyone's participation in writing back and sending photos of their city or neighborhood. That was the whole idea, to build a sense of community without having to leave the school, and to establish safe contact with other people. It seemed like such a fun idea. Over the next couple weeks the letters started to roll in. Most came with pictures of different landmarks, and each time a letter would come in, the teacher would pin the picture on a big wall map we had put up showing where the letter had come from and how far the balloon had traveled. It was a really smart idea, because we actually looked forward to coming to school to see if we had gotten our letter. For the duration of the year we had 1 day a week where we could write back to our pen pal or another student's pen pal in case our letter hadn't come in yet. Mine was one of the last to arrive. When I came into the classroom I looked at my desk and once again didn't see any letter waiting for me, but as I sat down the teacher approached me and handed me an envelope. I must have looked so excited because as I was about to open it she put her hand on mine to stop me and said, "Please don't be upset." I didn't understand what she meant. Why would I be upset now that my letter had come? Initially I was mystified that she would even know what was in the envelope. But now I realize that of course the teachers had screened the contents to make sure there was nothing obscene. But all the same, how could I be disappointed? When I opened the envelope I understood. There was no letter. The only thing in the envelope was a Polaroid, but I couldn't really make out what it was. It looked like a patch of desert, but it was too blurry to decipher. It appeared as if the camera had been moved while the picture was being taken. There was no return address, so I couldn't even write back if I wanted to. I was crushed. The school year pressed on, and the letters had stopped coming for nearly all of the other students. After all, you can only continue a written correspondence with a kindergartner for so long. Everyone, including myself, had lost interest in the letters almost completely. Then I got another envelope. My excitement was rejuvenated, and I reveled in the fact that I was still getting a letter when most of the other pen pals had abandoned their involvement. It made sense that I received another delivery. There had been nothing but a blurry picture in the first one, so this was probably to make up for that. But again, there was no letter at all, just another picture. This one was more distinguishable, but I still didn't understand it. The photograph was angled way up, catching the top corner of a building, and the rest of the image was distorted by a lens flare from the sun. Because the balloons didn't travel very far, and because they were all launched on the same day, the board became a bit cluttered, and so the policy for the students still exchanging letters became that they could take the photographs home. My best friend Josh had the second highest number of pictures taken home by the end of the year. His pen pal was really cooperative, and sent him pictures from all around the neighboring city. Josh took home, I think, 4 pictures. I took home nearly 50. The envelopes were all opened by the teacher, but after a while I stopped even looking at the pictures. However, I saved them in one of my drawers that housed my collections of rocks, baseball cards, comic book cards, Marvel metal cards, for those who might remember, and little miniature baseball batting helmets that I'd get out of a vending machine at Winn-Dixie after T-ball games. With the school year over, my attention turned to other things. My mom had gotten me a small snow cone machine for Christmas that year, and Josh had really coveted it, so much so that his parents bought him a slightly nicer one for his birthday, which was toward the end of the school year. That summer we had the idea that we would set up a snow cone stand to make money. We thought we'd make a fortune selling snow cones at $1. Josh lived in a different neighborhood, but we eventually decided that my neighborhood would be better because there were a lot of people who cared for their lawns. The yards in my neighborhood were slightly bigger. We did this for 5 weekends in a row until my mom told us that we had to stop, and I've only recently come to understand why she did that. On the 5th weekend, Josh and I were counting our money. Because we both had a machine, we each had a separate stack of money that we put together into one stack, and we then split it evenly. We had made a total of $16 that day, and as Josh paid out my $5th, a feeling of profound surprise consumed me. The dollar said, "For stamps." Josh noticed my shock and asked if he had miscounted. I told him about the dollar, and he said, "That's so cool, man." As I thought about it, I came to agree. The idea that the dollar had made it right back to me after changing so many hands floored me. I rushed inside to tell my mom, but my excitement coupled with her being distracted by a phone call made my story incomprehensible, and she responded simply by saying, "Oh wow, that's neat." Frustrated, I ran back outside and told Josh I had something to show him. Back in my room, I opened the drawer and took out the stack of envelopes and showed him some of the pictures. I started with the first picture, and we went through about 10 before Josh lost interest and asked if I wanted to go play in the ditch, a dirt ditch down the street from my house, before his mom came to pick him up, so that's what we did. We had a dirt war for a while, but it was interrupted several times by rustling in the woods around us. There were raccoons and stray cats that lived in there, but this was making a little too much noise, and we traded guesses at what it was in an attempt to scare each other. My last guess was that it was a mummy, but in the end Josh kept insisting that it was a robot because of the sounds that we heard. Before we left, he got a little serious and looked me right in the eyes and said, "You heard it, didn't you? It sounded like a robot. You heard it too, right?" I had heard it, and since it sounded mechanical, I agreed that it was probably a robot. It's only now that I understand what we heard. When we got back, Josh's mom was waiting for him at the kitchen table with my mom. Josh told his mom about the robot. Our moms laughed, and Josh went home. My mom and I ate dinner, and then I went to bed. I didn't stay in bed for long before I crept out and decided that, due to the day's events, I would revisit the envelopes, since now the whole affair seemed much more interesting. I took the first envelope and set it on the floor and set the blurry desert Polaroid on top. I laid the second envelope right next to it and placed the oddly angled Polaroid of a building's top corner on top, and did this with each picture until they formed a grid that was about 5 by 10. I was always taught to be careful with things that I was collecting, even if I wasn't sure they were valuable. I noticed that the pictures gradually became more decipherable. There was a tree with a bird on it, a speed limit sign, power line, a group of people walking into some building. And then I saw something that vexed me so powerfully that I can now, as I write this, distinctly remember feeling dizzy and capable of only a single, repeating thought. Why am I in this picture? In this photograph of the group of people entering the building, I saw myself holding hands with my mother in the very back of the crowd of people. We were at the very edge of the photo, but it was undeniably us. And as my eyes swam over the sea of Polaroids, I became increasingly anxious. It was a really odd feeling. It wasn't fear, it was the feeling you get when you are in trouble. I'm not sure why I was flooded with that feeling, but there I sat floundering in the distinct sense that I had done something wrong. And this feeling only intensified as I looked on at the rest of the photos after that, the one that had so powerfully struck me. I was in every photo. None of them were close shots. None of them were only of me. But I was in every single one of them, off to the side, in the back, bottom of the frame. Some of them only had the tiniest part of my face captured at the very edge of the photo, but nevertheless, I was there. I was always there. I didn't know what to do. Your mind works in funny ways as a kid, but there was a large part of me that was afraid of getting in trouble simply for still being up. Since I already had the looming feeling of having done something wrong, I decided that I would wait until tomorrow. The next day, my mom was off work and spent most of the morning cleaning up around the house. I watched cartoons, I imagine, and waited until I thought it was a good time to show her the Polaroids. When she went out to get the mail, I grabbed a couple of the pictures and put them on the table in front of me as I sat waiting for her to come back in. When returned, she was already opening the mail and threw some junk mail into the trash can, and I said, "Mom, can you come here for a second? I have these pictures. Just give me a minute, honey. I need to mark these on the calendar." After a minute or two, she came and stood behind me and asked me what I needed. I could hear her shuffling with the mail behind me, but I just looked at the Polaroids and told her about them. As I explained more and pointed to the pictures, her frequent "hus" and "okays" decreased, and she was suddenly completely quiet and only making a little noise with the mail. The next noise I heard from her sounded as if she was trying to catch her breath in a room that had no air left in it. At last her struggling gasps were conquered, and she simply dropped the remaining mail on the table and ran to the kitchen to get the phone. "Mom! I'm sorry, I didn't know about these. Don't be mad at me." With the phone pressed to her ear, she was walking/running back and forth and shouting into it. I nervously fiddled with the mail sitting next to my Polaroids. The top envelope had something sticking out of it that I thoughtlessly and anxiously pulled on until it came out. It was another Polaroid. Confused, I thought that somehow one of my Polaroids had slipped into the stack when she threw the mail down, but when I turned it over and looked at it, I realized that I had not seen this one before. To my dismay, it was me, but this one was a much closer shot. I was surrounded by trees and was smiling. But it wasn't just me, I noticed. Josh was there too. This was us from yesterday. I started yelling for my mom, who was still screaming into the phone. I repeated the yell for her until she finally responded with, "What?" And I could only think to ask, "Who are you calling?" "I'm talking with the police, honey." "But why?" "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything." She answered me with a response that I never understood until I was forced to revisit these events from the earliest years of my life. She grabbed the envelope off the table and the picture of Josh, and I spun and slid, landing next to the other Polaroids in front of me. She held the envelope up to my eyes, but I could only look at her and watch as all the color began draining out of her face. With tears welling up in her eyes, she said that she had to call the police because there was no postmark. An email from my daughter's killer. Posted by Double Door Bastard. Do you believe in coincidences? Seems like a funny question, doesn't it? I've never paid it much thought before now either. Perhaps I have some explaining to do. As of yesterday, it's been a year since my daughter went missing. There was never any ransom note, no remains discovered, and not an iota of evidence to support the standard theories of foul play and kidnapping. Aside from her absence itself, the whole situation seemed freakishly clean. At only 14 years old, she'd gone missing without a trace. Her name was Emily. I can say that dreaded was with confidence now. It's a bitter blessing, one that's come at great cost to all of us. When Emily disappeared, she left myself, her father, and her older brother, Joseph, in a state of perpetual anxiety. The limbo of monstrous uncertainty. Every phone call was a needle pressed into our skin, and every newscast that aired about that poor girl, still missing, presumed dead, felt like having boiling water poured down our throats. Not knowing, that's the real torture. Until yesterday, I truly believed that. Until yesterday, when I got an email from an unknown source. An email claiming to have the truth of what happened to Emily on that terrible day. The following is the contents of that email. From msassery1234@gmail.com. Subject: an apology for what I've done. Hello, Mrs. Stanfield. I won't tell you my name. That's not important right now. What's important is what I've done, and how sorry I am for doing it. I'll be quick and honest. Emily is dead, and I killed her. I would love to tell you it was quick and merciful, but it was neither. She died slowly and terribly. I can't imagine that my initial enjoyment of that fact will serve as any kind of consolation. I've loved Emily for a very long time, in what you might call an improper way. The hardest part was knowing she could never love me back, at least not in the way I loved her, though this wasn't for lack of trying, though. I'd made passes before, just silly attempts really, but she was never receptive to my affection. She was disgusted by me, and that made me feel small and angry. Though I can be thankful of the fact that she never told you about any of it. I guess it would have been terribly embarrassing for her if you knew. Not that she'll care now. Do you know how hard it is to cope with fantasy, Mrs. Stanfield? I've had such ugly dreams about Emily, and I know that they're ugly, but I still can't help but find them so exciting. I've wondered many times over the past year whether it was the ugliness of it all that made me so passionate. When all you've got is a fantasy that you think is unattainable, you spend lots of time refining it, like a sculptor chipping away at a statue, hoping to find perfection hidden in the granite. It doesn't matter how many times you secretly loosen the valves with your hands, that just keeps the fantasy down. It doesn't destroy it, can't destroy it. It just gains another component. Maybe it's another 15 minutes of torture, another scream. Maybe it's a different tool added to the kit. By the time the fantasy comes to boil, it's too complex to be satisfying on the basis of thought alone. You have to make it into flesh. Warm, satisfying flesh. And I did, Mrs. Stanfield, I really did. I have to be honest with you, it wasn't so much about wanting to live my fantasy, as it was about wanting to know whether I had it in me to carry it out. There was no dignity in pleasuring myself to the thoughts of violence, only in being able to say that I had the courage to do the one thing that had been giving my life any sort of meaning. And a year ago today, I proved that I did have that courage. My little indiscretions were in the past. I was patient, like a crocodile. I played the long game. I got Emily to trust me again with time. I let her be comfortable around me, let her drop her guard. She was on her way home from school when I finally took a chance and made my move. I picked out an old, beat-up shack in the woods in advance. I threw down a woolen tarp and prepared some shackles, I even lit a few candles for romantic effect. More for myself than her, admittedly. Emily was apprehensive at first, but I managed to talk her into visiting the little cabin with me. The door was shut and bolted behind us before she ever even saw the gun I was holding, but when she did, she was a good girl and didn't scream. Though I must say, I was a little disappointed at that. I'm not a pornographer, so I won't be lured with the details of what I did. I'm aware that it's perverse, but the wind outside hardly matters when you're a hurricane. My whole life was perversity, hidden and locked away. Emily was the outlet for that perversity. Part of me thinks I only ever loved her because she was convenient, because she was accessible. I used a hammer, a knife, a pair of pliers, and a power drill. It all got messier than I expected, so much blood, so much other things. All in all, it took a few hours before she finally died, which was admirable. She never did let me have my fun. Emily was such a strong girl. You should be proud of her, Mrs. Stanfield. For my own pride, I'd like to state that I didn't fuck her before she died. I couldn't bring myself to cross that barrier, knowing her eyes would be on me while it was happening. The thought of it disgusted me. She died, to the best of my knowledge, a virgin. Once I was fully done with her, and the euphoria of it all had passed, it dawned on me what a terrible thing I'd done. My pleasure turned to disgust, and all the sweetness that was inside of me while I was killing her turned sour. I realized that I was not meant to be a murderer, that it didn't suit me, that beyond the temporary pleasure of the act the thought of taking someone's life repulsed me. I was a fantasist who made a terrible, terrible mistake, one that cost the life of a promising young girl. If there is a grand plan out there that we're all a part of, I could feel that what I had done was a deviation from that natural law. I was disgusted at the act, and at myself. This little experiment had backfired on me entirely. I was so out of my depth. Once I'd gotten over the initial wave of fear and panic, I cut up Emily's body into smaller pieces that were easier to carry. I took all the pieces, wrapped them up in the woolen tarp, and burned them with lighter fluid in the woods. After that, I'd buried the bundle of charred bones and ashes, wishing I could have just forgotten all of it. Killing Emily and doing the things I did to her body were not acts of courage. I've realized that over the past year. They were acts of obsession and cowardice, of a person not strong enough to overcome their darker urges. I've been racked by guilt, surrounded by reminders of the life I've taken and can never give back. That's why I've decided to do the courteous thing and let you know that I've decided to take another life, mine. All I can ever be is a danger to the people around me, a time bomb destined to blow up and hurt another innocent. The only altruistic thing for a person in my position to do is take myself out of the picture. I'm sorry for what I did to Emily. I don't expect for you to forgive me, nor do I think I deserve it. I just hope this gives you some sense of closure and allows you to move on. My sincerest apologies. After I read that terrible email, I cried for hours. I didn't have that violent reaction because I believed I'd been contacted by my daughter's killer, but just because I felt like someone was playing a horrific joke on my family after we'd been through so much. And on the anniversary of our Emily's disappearance, no less. I didn't show my husband, or my son. I couldn't bear to. I just bore the cross myself, and wore a brave face for them, knowing the anniversary was hard on all of us. I wouldn't let the monster on the other end of that email tear up my family. But this morning, I heard two almighty bangs ring out from Joseph's bedroom. By the time his father and I had forced open the door, it was too late. He'd somehow gotten his hands on a gun and fired 2 shots, one through his laptop and another through his forehead. So, with this in mind, I'll ask you all again, do you believe in coincidences? My neighbor is one of those annoying wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself in lukewarm water, all the while screaming epic win, epic fail, or fuck, epic maintenance of the status quo, for all I know. It can get tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame. So, when he knocked on my door the other day, told me he was going away for a few weeks, and asked that I get his mail, honestly, it was a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing I didn't have to brace myself for any of his stupidity for a while. I was always afraid his stunts would wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then, one evening, I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to sender." I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. It was really freaking heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder, and I quickly realized there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs and through my front door. I decided I'd leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car in there. The garage door was a piece of shit that refused to open without a good thug and a whack. It was less trouble just leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set the package down while I struggled to open the tricky door. But you know how it is when you've got a good grip on something, no point in setting it down if you don't have to. It was as I kicked the door for a third time that I lost my grip on the package, and it fell to the ground. I heard a light crack inside. Shit, I cursed. I hoped I hadn't broken anything important, but figured I just wouldn't tell my neighbor about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck, and boy did it screech in protest as it rolled up and over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, setting it in the corner for whenever my neighbor would come back to claim it. And then, I forgot all about it. Until a few days passed, that is. I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the smell to waft in from the crack under the garage-to-house door, but it came in slow progression. It was a sickly sweet odor similar to a skunk, and for the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that's exactly what it was, roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realized the scent was growing more intense instead of fading that I went looking for a source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that's when the odor knocked me back, holding my nose. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. The only change in my garage was the box in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid from being left out of the fridge for so long. How much meat could have been in there for the box to have been so large and heavy? An entire freaking cow? I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in my hands. I probably wouldn't have needed them to open it, as it had become soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger, but I wasn't about to poke my finger into spoiled meat juices. That soggy bottom was the reason I had to open the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill onto the floor. I was going to have to dump the pieces of meat one garbage bag at a time, and take them down to the dumpster, a process I wasn't looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape along the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell couldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new gamut of stink. It was like opening a burning oven, but instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of piss, sweat, shit, and putrefaction. It was so bad that I staggered back and had to force down the puke begging to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled that scent mingling with the horrors coming out of the box. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran out the door for a breath of fresh air, but in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed a foothold into my home. I had to bite the bullet. I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open as though inviting me to look. I was prepared, a clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand, the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, and long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But as it turns out, I needed none of those things. I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of that box. I would only have to suffer the nightmares every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or a pig. No, it was worse than that. It was my neighbor. Dead. Still in one piece, but dead. I called the cops, and naturally, they took me in for interrogation. It's kind of hard not to suspect the man with a corpse in his garage, after all. Thankfully, they soon realized I wasn't involved. My DNA might have been all over that box, the smell might have left a mark throughout my house, but there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbor's own hands that proved my innocence: a vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not sure if they were allowed to, or if they felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbor was sitting in the box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He'd brought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours, or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbor recorded a few short clips about his progress. I think I'm in a truck now. I can feel it moving, must be in a warehouse. Pretty warm here. Still got plenty of food, that kind of stuff. And then, on the last entry, the box toppled over. He broke his neck, and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got too full, or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video. One thing I heard in the footage that will haunt me to the day I die. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door. A Ghost Testimony by Emery Miles. After the living and the dead decided to merge worlds, the Supreme Court was flooded with appeals. With coexist being a hot topic in the first half of the 21st century, most people thought it would be a great idea to create a union between the two worlds. They thought they'd get their loved ones back. They thought they'd get access to generational wisdom from their deceased elders back, and perhaps some old family recipes could finally resurface. People could only think of the missing pieces in their lives that they wanted to finally have sewn up with the help of a familiar, ghostly face around. It was an oversight, to say the least, that with ghosts being, almost, as accessible as the living, there would now be witnesses for crimes where before there had been none. It actually caused a lot of chaos across the criminal justice system, especially for police officers who had tampered with evidence to shut a case quickly, for gang members who'd offed witnesses to shut their mouths, and it was a goddamn headache for judges who had to reopen every murder case from the last several decades that now suddenly had a victim who could tell their side of the story. But for Jeremy Strout, it was a lifeline. He'd been sitting on death row for 15 years after being convicted of 4 heinous murders, his wife and 3 children. At the time of his conviction, there'd been no one there to defend him, just whispers from neighbors who'd said they'd heard him yelling in his house hours before the bodies were discovered. It didn't help that he was the one who'd called 911 and then was found at the scene of the crime covered in their blood. It didn't help that he'd sought out anger management before in his past. Rumors swam through town like a broken dam, neighbors speculating that he hadn't wanted their 3rd child, that little Harley Sue was a mistake Mrs. Strout made Jeremy keep, and that he'd finally snapped under the pressure of 3 small children and a wife whose fertility had betrayed him. Jeremy had always denied the rumors, claiming that he loved his family. Sure, they had their problems, and he never denied the hardship of not only providing for 3 children under 5, but living under the same roof as them. Nevertheless, he remained adamant in his defense. He would never harm them. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough. Statistically, said the prosecutor, people are more likely to be killed by their spouse than any other person in the world. And of course, Mr. Strout could not leave his children to live after killing Mrs. Strout, because who would take care of the children while he was at work? And if he had not done it, then why so much blood, not only on his clothes, but in his fingernails, wedged between eyebrow hairs, and in the wrinkles of his temples? And the even bigger question, if Mr. Strout had not murdered his family, then who did? There had never been another suspect. The police never really took the time to consider one, their minds made up before they could produce an alternative. It really was easier just to blame the husband. What jury wouldn't go for that? Today our jury gets to hear a new side to the story. Jeremy's defense attorney told the courtroom at his appeal hearing, nearly 2 decades after his family's murders. From Mrs. Strout's perspective, Mr. Alcott enticed the crowd with a smile that said he had a secret, one he was eager to share. Attorneys could be a bit performative in their speeches, and Mr. Alcott was no less confident. The union between the dead and the living truly did save some attorneys' careers, as it had not always been every day that they could produce eyewitness testimony that could turn a case on its heel. Some started getting big heads about it, as if they had more power than the judges, and Mr. Alcott's once regular-shaped head was slowly growing in size. Jeremy, who'd known him since his family's gruesome deaths, knew that Mr. Alcott came from a humble and passionate place. He just wanted to help people. And more than anything on this day, he wanted to help Jeremy. The only problem with ghosts as witnesses was time. The worlds were combined, yes, ghosts were all around. But time for the living and time for the dead, they existed on 2 separate lines, intersecting at points that were not always convenient. Ghosts floated from here to there to here, teleporting across space and time, and their biggest adjustment to being reunited with the living was adhering to the old, third-dimensional clock. You could not simply tell a ghost to show up in court at 9 a.m. and expect them to find where that time existed for them. The closest thing living humans had to relate this ghostly state of nonlinear existence was to elderly people with dementia. They hopped from place to place, time to time, without any real sense of how they got there. Ghost therapists, a new occupation created by the psychologists, blended a team of living and dead to try to help condition ghosts into grasping the concept of earthly time, but like any therapy, it was not an immediate remedy. Realistically, Mr. Alcott could only hope that Mrs. Strout would appear in court. But there was no way to be certain she would find her way there at the right time and place of the court hearing. Yet still, he spoke as if there were not a single doubt in his mind. Today, we will get to hear an eyewitness account of the events that took place on October 26, 2023, from one of the victims' perspectives. And how grateful are we that it is now possible. Mr. Alcott turned to face Jeremy Strout, seated at the defense table, shackled at his wrists and ankles, both sets of chains locked in place by a hook on the tabletop and the floor. Jeremy was trembling, just as nervous as he was during his first trial, which certainly had not helped his case. He tapped his feet anxiously, and Mr. Alcott took his seat beside him. "Don't you worry, Jeremy. I've spoken to Mrs. Strout, and I know she wants to be here. She feels just awful that all of this has fallen on you. I have no doubt she will find her way here, even with those kids of yours keeping her busy. Who'd have thought dead kids could still be such a handful?" "Ha!" Jeremy didn't laugh, so Mr. Alcott cleared his throat. "She's got a wonderful therapist, Jeremy. They've been working really hard on timeliness so she can be here for you today. He's the best therapist around. He worked so hard when he was alive, it nearly killed him. Ha ha! But really, it was the alcohol that did it." Despite Mr. Alcott's poor humor, his assurances did give Jeremy hope. After all, that was all he had left. The courtroom remained mostly silent as the hours carried on, everyone waiting, now accustomed to the concept of ghostly testimonies and also of their inability to make prompt appearances. If people had thought court cases dragged on before, waiting on a dead person to show up had made the old ways seem swift. Every so often as the clock ticked, a ghost would find themselves in the pews alongside the other patient attendees, causing a stir in the crowd. An elderly man piped up around the second long hour, reminiscing. "I remember when they built this courthouse in 1949. Apparently, he had been a little boy with a dream of becoming the president one day, at the time fascinated by the building's exterior columns and interior mahogany. On the third hour, a child ghostling chased a ball around the courtroom giggling about how his dad used to work upstairs. On the fourth hour, a former janitor peeked his head in to see if the garbage needed to be changed. It was the fifth hour when the judge, who had spent nearly all of the hours engrossed in a book, announced that if Mrs. Strout did not find her way here in 10 minutes, her testimony would have to be rescheduled and the court would be adjourned. Jeremy's foot resumed its tapping. Mr. Alcott nudged him, winking. "She'll be here." Jeremy's hope was nearly run dry when the clock struck 5 hours and 11 minutes since the court hearing was set to start. The banging from the judge's gavel was still resounding while a symphony of people gathering their things and sighing at the wasted day trickled across the room. All of it was at just the perfect volume for Mrs. Strout's meager voice to almost be missed. Almost. "Hello?" she said. "Hello? Did I make it on time?" The noise in the room was like a faucet sputtering out until it finally stilled. Everyone froze in their tracks and turned towards the voice to find an equally meager and transparent figure seated at the witness stand. When Jeremy laid eyes on her, she looked as beautiful as the day he married her. Not appearing in the form in which one died was a feature of ghosthood that all appreciated. "Sonora?" Jeremy whispered. At her name, the ghost frantically searched for its source. When she landed on Jeremy, relief softened and warmed her face. "Jeremy," she smiled. Then, as if her reason for being here suddenly rushed to her mind, she jerked towards the judge, who was still frozen in his half-standing, half-seated stance, considering if he should allow this hearing to take place. "Your Honor, you have to set him free. He's innocent. Please," she pleads. "Sonora, where are the kids?" Jeremy asked worriedly. His ghastly wife faced him again. "They're fine, dear. Well, they're dead, but they're fine. They're at the park, playing." Jeremy thought of little Harley Sue, not even 2 when she passed, off at the park playing without an adult. Sonora read his expression. "I figure not much else can happen to them now." She shrugged, forcing a laugh. Mr. Alcott, who was already up on his feet, cleared his throat and approached the judge's bench, nodding a hello to Mrs. Strout. "Your Honor, would you please allow Mrs. Strout to give her testimony? We've waited all this time, and if we prolong it any further, we cannot guarantee her appearance again." The judge was tired and hungry and ready to sit on his couch and kick his feet up. But he was also reasonable. He surrendered a sigh. All right, Mr. Alcott. Court reinstated." He tapped his gavel, and the jurors all groaned as they found their seats again. "Make it quick, Mrs. Strout. We had all day, but that day is nearly gone." Mr. Alcott turned to Jeremy, giving him 2 thumbs up. Jeremy released all of the air he was holding onto. Mrs. Strout nodded and straightened in her seat, running her hands across her lap as if to flatten her dress. Out of habit, most ghosts seemed to retain this gesture. Mrs. Strout inhaled before she spoke. "The day I died, there was a harvest moon on the rise, the children were loud and the house was a mess, and the fridge was nearly empty. I hadn't gotten to laundry in over a week. It was a pretty typical day in our house, actually," Mrs. Strout joked. Only a few in the room offered an empathetic laugh. The judge was less patient. "Mrs. Strout, while I have sympathy for your tragic death and the death of your 3 children, you are here to tell us if it was that man, Mr. Jeremy Strout, who did it. We do not need a bedtime story." Jeremy flinched at another man telling his wife what to do. "Let her speak." The judge shot him a daring gaze. Mr. Alcott squeezed his shoulder. Sonora thanked him with her eyes, but behind them was a painful secret rising to the surface. "Of course, Your Honor. I know I've already taken up a lot of your time," she said, addressing the whole courtroom full of people. Then she looked down at her lap, twiddling her fingers. "The truth is, my children and I were killed by one of their parents." A gasp echoed across the walls of the room, and an uproar of whispers scattered like static. Mr. Alcott and Jeremy shared a confused stare. The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" Everyone started to hush, but it wasn't until Sonora shouted that silence fully resumed. "But it wasn't Jeremy!" Sonora was crying now, looking directly at her husband. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. Jeremy's foot stopped bouncing. His mind was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. All these years, people had assumed he had murdered his entire family, but the truth was he honestly didn't know what had happened to them. Just like he told the police, he'd come home from a long day at work and walked into the most horrific and life-shattering scene he'd ever witnessed. No one believed him. Sonora's sobs were the only sound in the courtroom as everyone patiently waited for her to collect herself. Thankfully, Kleenex had developed a ghost-friendly facial tissue, and one of the guards brought it over to her. She wiped her eyes and spoke sternly, as if she had not just been wailing with abandon. "Your Honor, you need to release my husband from prison right now." "What are you saying, Sonora?" Jeremy whispered. The next words that Jeremy's wife spoke were undeniably the most important of his entire life. More life-altering than the ones spoken by the police who arrested him and the judge who convicted him. Sonora's words freed Jeremy Strout from a prison death sentence and cleared his name of all criminal charges. But in the same instance, her words shackled him all over again, leaving him forever haunted by the truth. "Jeremy Strout did not kill our children," she said. "I did."